So I just watched Doctor Who Flux, and now I am filled with a righteous fury at the loss of all the time I wasted on it. Once upon a time, many years ago, Doctor Who was my favorite show on TV, and while I have always thought that Chris Chibnall taking over as showrunner marked a significant decrease in the general quality of the show's writing, it was not until the second half of the Flux serial that I realized that I truly, genuinely hate the direction that Chris Chibnall has taken this series in. However, before I go any further, I want to make it as blatantly clear as possible that I do not hate Chris Chibnall. I do not hate Jodie Whittaker, and I do not intend anything I say in this video to be an attack on their character or that of anyone who worked on this season of the show. No matter how baffled I am that someone who was okay with submitting these final drafts got to be showrunner of Doctor Who, I do not hate or even dislike anyone involved in this production as people. I just believe some remarkably poor writing decisions were made here. Everyone clear on that? Good. I'm aiming to make this review as beginner-friendly as possible, insofar as a phrase like beginner-friendly can be applied to Doctor Who Flux. So if you haven't seen the season or the larger series and don't intend to, you'll hopefully be able to follow along at least to some degree. But unlike every other video in this series so far, this video will not have a non-spoiler section, largely because this narrative structure is so convoluted that I'm genuinely at a loss as to what even constitutes a spoiler. But regardless, spoilers for Doctor Who Flux, as well as the preceding Doctor Who Series 12, can and will happen at any time from now on, so if you want to go into either season blind, this is your final warning to turn off the video. For everybody else, let's lay some basic groundwork and necessary background knowledge for the non-Who fans, or people who may have fallen off the show in recent years. Doctor Who is a widely beloved sci-fi series about an alien called the Doctor, who travels through space and time in a ship called the TARDIS that looks like a blue police box and is bigger on the inside. The show was launched in 1963, starring William Hartnell as the Doctor, who was likely intended, but never explicitly stated at the time, to be a human scientist from the future, until Hartnell's waning health prompted the writers to establish that the Doctor was actually an alien called a Time Lord, a race who could escape death through a process called regeneration, in which they gain a new body and a new personality, but retain their memories and the same general core principles. Later in the series, it was established that each Time Lord can regenerate 12 times for a total of 13 incarnations. The show was cancelled in 1989, and the period from 1963 to 1989 is typically referred to as Classic Who. A movie was released in 1996 in an attempt to kickstart a reboot, but the movie was not very well liked by fans, and that reboot attempt failed. But the show was successfully rebooted in 2005. This incarnation of the show is still running to this day and is typically referred to as Modern Who or New Who. Due to some complicated plot reasons that I won't get into here, the version of the Doctor that the fans called the 11th Doctor was actually the 13th incarnation of the character, but the Time Lords granted him a new set of regenerations. As of the writing of this script, the latest incarnation is the 13th Doctor, actually the 15th incarnation of the character, played by Jodie Whittaker. Or so we thought. See, In the finale of the 12th season of Modern Who, it was revealed that the Doctor is actually a being called the Timeless Child, who was a creature from another universe found and adopted by a native of the Time Lord home planet Gallifrey named Tecteun, who discovered the Doctor's ability to regenerate. Apparently, the Timeless Child actually had unlimited regenerations, and performed inhumane experiments on the child to discover the genetic secret of regeneration, which she then spread around to her species, but limited the number of regenerations for poorly defined plot reasons, and therefore became one of the founding members of Gallifreyan society as we know it. This, of course, means that the Doctor is basically the original Time Lord. The Timeless Child retcon is not explicitly confirmed to be, but generally considered as a sort of modern adaptation of the Cartmel Master Plan, a fan term for an idea conceived of by Andrew Cartmel, Doctor Who's chief script editor from 1987 to 1989. It aimed to make the Doctor more mysterious again by eventually revealing that the Doctor was basically a regeneration of the Other, a mysterious Time Lord who was one of the 3 legendary inventors of time travel and founder of Time Lord Society. Although the very early groundwork for this was laid in the final few seasons of the classic series, the show was cancelled before it could really be explored, and it eventually came to fruition in the 1997 tie-in novel Lungbarrow, which is not strictly relevant since expanded media isn't typically considered canon to the main TV show. Anyway, the Timeless Child spent an unknown number of lifetimes working for the super secret Gallifreyan organization Division, before eventually having their memory wiped and taking on the name Doctor in the William Hartnell incarnation. The Timeless Child retcon was extremely controversial for a variety of reasons that I'm not going to get into, but despite the episode immediately following this being pretty much entirely self-contained, Doctor Who Flux proved that Chris Chibnall intends to go full speed ahead with the concept, despite the massive fan backlash, and if nothing else, I can admire the commitment. One more thing before we actually start discussing Doctor Who Flux. UNIT is an Earth-based military task force created to handle extraterrestrial threats. One of the founders of UNIT was Brigadier Sir Alistair Gordon Lethbridge Stewart, who the Doctor considered one of his best friends. The character has never appeared in the modern series, and the actor who portrayed him passed away in 2011, with the character passing away peacefully off-screen in the same year in universe. Since then, UNIT has been led by the Brigadier's daughter, Kate Stewart. With all that out of the way, I think we're finally ready to go, so allow me to rant for a while about how much I don't like what this showrunner has done with this show. Chibnall-era Who has always had a bit of a pacing problem, mostly originating from Chibnall always seeming to want to shove an episode and a half worth of content into every episode he writes. This was already starting to show back in 2013's Season 7, when he guest wrote the episodes Dinosaur on a Spaceship and The Power of Three, the former of which introduced 3 temporary companions in addition to the 2 permanent companions who were already there. That's a total of too many companions for those not keeping track. And the latter of which was actually pretty good, until it suddenly had quite possibly the most rushed and unsatisfying ending in the entire series, with the villain just leaving for absolutely no reason whatsoever, and the Doctor just buzzing the problem away with his magic wand, sonic screwdriver. But the worst offender of this, I would say, is the aforementioned episode The Timeless Children, which tried to shove the companions attempting to escape a Cyberman ship, the Cybermen attempting to conquer Gallifrey, the Master unceremoniously murdering the main villain of the previous 2 episodes while taking control of the Cybermen, and dryly expositing the Timeless Child reveal to the Doctor, and the Doctor attempting to come to terms with the new secrets about her past, all in a 65-minute runtime. But if you thought that was bad, wait until we get into Flux. Just to give you a quick taste of how horribly overstuffed this season was, here's a list of all the protagonists that appeared in at least 2 episodes of this serial, which, keep in mind, is only 6 episodes long. The Doctor, Yaz, Dan, Carvanista, Belle, Vinder, Diane, Joseph Williams, Claire, Jericho, and Kate. That's 11 protagonists in a 6-episode serial. 12 if you want to call the Ood a protagonist. And remember, that's only the people who appeared in multiple episodes, because there are at least 6 more who only appear in a single episode. That's too many freaking protagonists. I took a crappy phone picture that may or may not be on screen right now of a shot in the season finale where a bunch of them are greeting the Doctor as she regains consciousness, and they can barely all fit in the frame, and several of them aren't even there at this point. And with all these characters come plot threads. So many plot threads, so many of them completely superfluous, nearly as superfluous as most of this review, am I right? But I think the best way to convey all that information is to take you on an episode-by-episode trip through the season. Episode 1 was titled The Halloween Apocalypse, which is already a title I really don't like, but that's beside the point. I'm not going to tell you the events of this episode in the order that the actual episode does, because it jumps around incessantly, but do keep in mind that all this happens in the span of 50 minutes. So we cold open on Joseph Williamson, some rich dude digging tunnels under Liverpool in the 18th century. Another guy is here to tell him not to dig the tunnels, and Williamson says, "No, I'm gonna dig the tunnels." Already, this scene doesn't need to be here because Williamson doesn't actually become relevant to the plot until episode 5, but also because I fully believe that you could have cut him out of the season entirely and very little of substance would have been lost. Get ready to hear me say that about a lot of characters coming up soon. Way off in deep space, a weird blue skull alien named Swarm starts a psychic Zoom meeting with the Doctor and forces her to watch him escape from the prison he's been in since the dawn of time, apparently. And then he ends the Zoom meeting and goes off to Earth, where a man and a woman are living in a house in the Arctic Circle, and a weird alien alarm in their garage starts going off, and they apparently know exactly what this means, and Swarm shows up and kills the man, and it turns out that the woman was a member of Swarm species named Azure in disguise. We never get an explanation of who these two humans are, or why one of them was an alien in disguise, or how they apparently knew what the alarm meant, despite the woman showing no indications of knowing that she's an alien in disguise, before Swarm forcibly removes said disguise. Why is this scene here? It serves literally no purpose whatsoever. So anyways, Swarm is a portent of doom, I guess, and with him comes the giant space fart known as the Flux, which destroys everything in its path. We find out later that Swarm and Azure are not responsible for the Flux and are just taking advantage of it, so how did they know it was coming, and why did Swarm's breakout coincide with its emergence? Well, it's heavily implied later on that Swarm and Azure have some sort of clairvoyance or future vision or something of the like, but that's about as much as we're gonna get about that. Off on a space station somewhere, an exiled soldier named Vinder watches the Flux destroy a few planets before he gets sucked into it and sent off somewhere else. Now, hold on. Why does the Flux destroy planets, but send people hurtling through space and time? Let's come back to that later, shall we? First, we need to get introduced to Dan Lewis, our new main companion. He's impersonating a tour guide at a museum, but then the museum's boss, Diane, kicks him out. But Dan and Diane have known each other for a while and are clearly into each other, so Dan faces no consequences and they agree to go out for a drink later. Then Dan goes volunteering at a food bank, and as he's headed home, the boss of the food bank, Wilma, tells him to bring home some soup for himself. Dan is poor, by the way. I'm not going to bring this up much. And Dan says that no one likes soup. I realize that this was him trying to turn down the offer for help in a humorous way, but I'm still mad at him for saying that no one likes soup. But hold on a second, why is Wilma here? This is literally the only time she appears in the entire serial, so there's no reason why you couldn't just roll Wilma and Diane into the same character. Anyway, Dan goes home and it's Halloween, so people come to do trick-or-treat, and there's another comedy scene that, even though I personally didn't find it very funny, I wouldn't normally mind, except that this episode and this series needed a serious pacing overhaul. But then Carvanista breaks into Dan's home and abducts him onto a spaceship. Oh yeah, did I forget to mention Carvanista? He's a dog alien called a Lupari. The doctor and main companion Yaz were fighting at the beginning of the episode, which makes this quite a nice segue into the main plot, or what I think is supposed to be the main plot. The Doctor and Yaz are convinced that Carvanista wants to destroy Earth because he worded some stuff in the most obtuse and misleading way possible because plot contrivances, so they chase him to Earth and track him down to Dan's house and just miss Dan being abducted, but they do find out that there are 7 billion Lupari ships heading for Earth. Oh no, it can only be an invasion force. So they leave and go back to the TARDIS, but they're interrupted by a random lady named Claire showing up, and Claire obviously recognizes the Doctor and says some ominous stuff, and then leaves and gets poofed away by a weeping angel. For reasons I will explain later, this scene really didn't need to be there. Also, I almost forgot to mention that there's a random scene in there somewhere of Sontarans planning to take advantage of the Flux by invading Earth, because we have to set up our upcoming villains somehow. Anyway, the Doctor and Yaz TARDIS up to Carvanista's ship and rescue Dan, and then find out that the Lupari aren't coming to invade. They've actually each been assigned a human from birth that they're supposed to protect, and Dan is Carvanista's human, and the Lupari are coming to rescue the humans from the Flux, because putting a single human on each Lupari ship is clearly an efficient use of resources. Also, with how constant alien invasions of various types are on Earth, why have the Lupari never come to help before? Whatever, who cares? The Doctor suggests that instead of getting the humans off Earth, the Lupari just form a shell of their flux-proof ships around the planet to protect it. And Carvanista does that because apparently he can control all the Lupari ships remotely. The Doctor, Yaz, and Dan are in the TARDIS outside the shield, though, and the Doctor shoots a beam of vortex energy into the Flux to try to stop it, but it does nothing. So the TARDIS is swallowed up, and the trio are yoked across time, and that's the end of episode 1. In conclusion, it was weird and awkwardly paced and messy, but at least it wasn't the worst episode in the season. I promise, not all the episode summaries are going to be this long. So now we come to Flux Chapter 2, War of the Sontarans. And this is where the biggest plot twist in Flux actually happens. And no, that plot twist isn't some grand revelation about the Doctor's past, or division, or who Swarm and Azure are. It's that War of the Sontarans is actually good. Doctor Who Flux Chapter 2, War of the Sontarans is a good episode. And I don't even mean just by Chibnall era standards either, because while I would never go so far as to call this a masterpiece, it is comfortably an above average episode of modern Doctor Who. That's right, I can say good things about Chibnall sometimes. So basically, the story is that the Sontarans snuck onto Earth in the moments before the Lupari shield closed, and are now using the Flux's time weirdness to try to invade history and rewrite it so that they always controlled the planet. The Doctor, Yaz, and Dan have all been scattered throughout time, with Dan landing in modern-day Liverpool, where the Sontarans have set up their central command, the Doctor landing in the Crimean War, and Yaz going off on her own brief adventure that we'll get to later. The Doctor meets Mary Seacole and Lieutenant General Logan, and with their help, figures out a plan to drive the Crimean Sontarans back to the 21st century, where Dan, who has independently decided to sneak onto a Sontaran ship and communicated with the Doctor by means of Sontaran Time Skype trademark, will shut down the entire operation. Dan comes under fire from the Sontarans, but Carvanista shows up to rescue him, and together they ran one Sontaran ship into another to set off a chain reaction that destroys the entire fleet. Meanwhile, in the past, General Logan goes against the Doctor's wishes and blows up the Sontarans instead of letting them safely retreat. The Doctor really feels like Doctor in this one. There's a scene where General Logan breaks down in tears and begs the Doctor for help, and despite the fact that he has been nothing but rude and dismissive, and sometimes even downright cruel to her for the entire episode, she immediately brings him into her plan to stop the Sontarans without criticizing him for anything he's done to her up to that point. And that just feels like a really Doctor kind of move, you know? Yaz and Dan are resourceful and self-sufficient and heroic, which is something we rarely see out of Chibnall-era companions. Mary Seacole and General Logan are engaging side characters. Dan's parents are fun comic relief who take up an appropriately small amount of screen time for how little they contribute. Dan and Carvanista share some pretty solid comedic chemistry. I have to admit that as much as I don't like Chibnall's writing, he's surprisingly good at writing other people's villains well, and the Sontarans here are just the right mix of intimidating and silly, and it's just an all-around enjoyable episode that is, quite frankly, pretty much the only episode of Flux I can really see myself coming back to in the future. Now, I've neglected to mention Yaz's story, not because I think it's bad. In fact, I'd go so far as to say that Yaz is served better by this episode than by almost every other episode in the 3 seasons she's been a companion, beat out only by Season 12's Can You Hear Me? The reason I haven't talked about what Yaz does so far is because it's mostly unconnected to the Sontaran plot and exists solely to set up Episode 3. She lands in a mysterious place called the Temple of Atropos on a planet called Time, which happens to be where Vinder was sent by the Flux back in Episode 1, and the two of them meet a floating triangle robot guy who asks them to help repair an area where the creatures called the Mori are regulating time, or something like that. It's not clearly explained. Anyway, Swarm and Azure show up with a new third villain called Passenger, and Yaz and Vinder are immediately put on the back foot as Azure kills a couple of the Mori and force Yaz and Vinder onto their pedestals. The Doctor and Dan show up in the TARDIS after shutting down the Sontaran temporal offensive, just before Swarm and Azure restart the Mori pedestals, and they jump onto some of those pedestals themselves to try dividing up the Time Force more so it doesn't immediately kill Yaz and Vinder. Yeah, I don't know what this all means either, just roll with it. And with that, Episode 2 is over. Episode 3 is called Once Upon Time, and sees the Doctor, Yaz, Dan, and Vinder forced to relive some of their memories, but with parts of them altered, usually by other protagonists replacing certain people in their memories, but other times in weirder ways. Now, after War of the Sontarans, Once Upon Time was the most excited I'd been for a new Doctor Who episode since 2017, so Imagine my disappointment when it turned out to be effectively a really long exposition dump that doesn't actually convey much new information at all. But before we get to that, we need to be introduced to new protagonist Bell, who is escaping all the monsters like the Daleks and Cybermen that have taken over in the aftermath of the Flux, and who wants to find someone who we find out at the end of the episode is Vinder, the father of the child Bell is pregnant with. There's some incredibly clunky dialogue that happens to establish that, by the way. It's not super clear how the monsters took over because of the Flux, when the Flux's whole thing is that it destroys planets. But somewhere else in the story, it's implied that these guys started taking over planets because their own planets got destroyed, so I guess I can accept that as a fair explanation. Anyway, back to convoluted memory plotline. Dan revisits his past with Diane in a series of scenes that are cute but don't really convey much about him, except stuff that happened to him in the past that doesn't really have a tangible impact on his present characterization. Not that any of these characters have much characterization at all, much less any that affect the direction of the story. But he also has a bunch of visions of passengers showing up in random places. Either the Doctor or one of the villains, I honestly can't be bothered to remember which, shows up to explain to the audience, I mean to Dan, that Passenger is basically a living prison containing a pocket dimension that can store something like 5 million people at a time, so that's a thing now. Vinder recalls why he was sent into exile in the first place. He was a whistleblower for this big evil politician or nobleman or something called the Grand Serpent. The Doctor catches a glimpse of some of her memories that got erased when she led a siege on the Temple of Atropos alongside Carvanista, who I have failed to mention is a former Division agent, because except for this one part of this one episode, it really isn't that significant. The temple was then under the control of a species called the Ravagers, who turn out to be Swarm and Azur's species, and Swarm goes on this big rant about how time and space are at war, and the Ravagers represent time, and Division represents space, and yes, that is a real sentence that I just said, and I hope you don't want any aspect of it explained, because that never freaking happens. Meanwhile, Yaz does nothing. Absolutely nothing of consequence happens in Yaz's memories. It has literally been a meme in the Doctor Who fandom since Yaz was introduced that there is no point to her being there, and just when we think we're going to have a season of just the Doctor and Yaz, so we can actually focus on giving Yaz a freaking personality, Chibnall has to dump 9 other protagonists on us because he can't be bothered to do anything with Yaz. Literally, the only episode to actually develop Yaz was Can You Hear Me from season 12, which established that Yaz spent at least 3 years dealing with suicidal ideation, and we're not going to touch on that at all? I can tell you from experience that suicidal ideation can be pretty freaking life-consuming, and forcing Yaz to relive those experiences could have given us some sort of opportunity for character growth, similarly to how Dan's memories were about him opening up to Diane for the first time, about how he was stood up at the altar, or how Vinder was literally begging not to be shown the time that he gave up a promising career and the chance to see his girlfriend again in years at least in order to expose a politician's corruption, but instead, the most important things to focus on in Yaz's life were the time she ate a salad while listening to her coworker ramble, or the time she played video games while listening to her sister ramble. Is Yaz supposed to be a good listener? Is that what these scenes are trying to convey? Or is it just excuses for the Doctor to show up and spout meaningless technobabble without interrupting anything important, because it sure feels like the latter? Hey Chris, can I call you Chris? Give your characters a character, please, Chris! Yaz has been around for 28 episodes now! You no longer have any excuses. Sorry, had to get that out of my system. Back to the plot. So the doctor goes inside Passenger somehow, and there are some Mori there, and the doctor asks them to go replace herself and the three humans. Hold on, is Vinder a human? That's never actually made clear. Whatever, it's not important. The doctor asks the Mori to go replace herself and the three humans on the Mori pedestals, and the Mori agree, because apparently they could freely leave Passenger at any time, so why the heck didn't they do that before? There is absolutely no in-universe reason why this entire episode needed to happen. So, the Doctor and company are back in the present now, and Swarm is like, surprise, Diane is inside Passenger. Isn't that so terrible, Dan? But, like, why? This is me, BrainyDiode, talking again. Why is Diane inside Passenger? As far as we know, nobody else from Earth is inside Passenger. So why did Swarm and Azure decide to single her out specifically? Was it to emotionally manipulate Dan? He's also just some guy who has been traveling with the Doctor for all of a couple hours at this point as a matter of convenience, and he really doesn't contribute to the plot beyond this point. So even if the Ravagers can see the future, what reason do they have to screw with Dan? And while we're on the subject, let's talk about Passenger itself for a second. What actually is it? Is it a Ravager? We saw multiple of them in the Doctor's memories of the siege of Atropos, and Vinder has apparently seen or at least heard of them before, so are they their own species? It doesn't speak ever, and its face is a mask. I'm not speaking figuratively, by the way. Somebody on the Doctor Who subreddit actually found the mask they used for Passenger on Amazon for like $15. This is not a criticism. I get it. BBC budgets are notoriously small, but my point is that Passenger is physically incapable of facially emoting. It doesn't speak, it doesn't visually emote, it always just does whatever Swarm and Azure tell it to, and after they die in episode 6, it starts doing whatever the Doctor tells it to. So does it even have free will? Is it sapient? Is it even actually alive, or is it some sort of robot or something? I sure hope you don't want any of those questions answered, because they never are. Anyway, episode 3 is over. It's time for episode 4, Village of the Angels. This is the only episode of the series with a co-writer, that being Maxine Alderton. And let me just say, I really hope Alderton sticks around as a guest writer after Chibnall leaves. She was the lead writer for season 12's The Haunting of Villa Diodati, which is by far my favorite Chibnall-era episode, and Village of the Angels is considered the best episode of Flux by a lot of people. While I don't hold it in quite as high regard, War of the Sontarans beats it out for me. That's mostly because the Weeping Angels feel a bit played out to me at this point. The character writing, though, feels so much better in this episode than almost anything else Chibnall has done. I know this is just a silly gag line, but at one point, new protagonist Professor Jericho asks the Doctor how she got into his house, and she says that the door was unlocked, and he says it wasn't, and she says it was after she unlocked it, but let's not worry about the order of things. And I can very, very clearly picture that exact line coming out of the 11th Doctor's mouth. And frankly, it's a strong contender for my favorite 13th Doctor moment just because of that. She just feels so much more doctory than usual in this episode, and it's so dang refreshing. Anyway, plot. So at the end of episode 3, they dumped Vinder on a random abandoned planet so he could look for Belle, and then a Weeping Angel took control of the TARDIS because remember when they said the angels have the phone box in Blink? Critically acclaimed and fan favorite Doctor Who episode Blink? Remember when they said that iconic line in the Weeping Angel debut episode Blink? It's happening for realsies now. It's that thing you know, but again, somebody literally says the angel has the TARDIS, and I just... Look, it doesn't matter. The Angel lands the Protag squad in an English village in the 1960s, which happens to be where Claire wound up after she poofed back in episode 1. Remember Claire? I don't. So apparently, the reason she recognized the Doctor is not because she met her in the future and got sent back in time by an angel to the present. Oh no, that would make too much sense. See, Claire is psychic and had premonitions about the angels and the Doctor and the Flux, and now the angels are... Hey, do you guys remember when this plot used to be about stopping the Flux? Do you guys remember how that's what this entire serial is named after? Has anybody else noticed that we're on episode 4 now, and nobody has even attempted to make any progress on that since episode 1? So, Claire is visiting a parapsychologist named Professor Jericho because of her premonitions, and the Doctor makes a psychic link with her and finds out that there's an angel manifesting in her mind through her memories of it. As absurd as this sounds, this is not a new piece of lore. This is something the angels have been able to do since season 5. So, the Doctor and the angel have a nice chat, and we find out that it's a former Division agent, because of course it is, and all the other angels that are closing in around Jericho's lab are also Division agents, and the Claire angel defected and wants to help the Doctor escape. Meanwhile, Yaz and Dan are helping the townsfolk look for a missing girl named Peggy, who's like 6 years old or something, and they get poofed back to 1901 and find Peggy there, and they realize that the angels have somehow trapped the 1901 version of the town in a pocket dimension with no way back to the regular universe, but they can still see what's going on in the 1960s version of the town. So they watch the Doctor, Jericho, and Claire escape from Jericho's lab and get surrounded by angels, and the Claire angel is suddenly working for Division again, which brings into question what the entire point of this episode was. So the Doctor gets freaking turned into a weeping angel so the angels can bring her back to Division headquarters, and they send Jericho to the 1901 pocket dimension, and quite frankly, I do not remember what happens to Claire. I do not care what happens to Claire. Claire is such a nothing character, but she shows up again in the finale, so I guess something happened to her. Also, in this episode, Belle finds out that Azure has been going around the universe tricking large groups of Flux refugees into passenger so she can kill them faster, I guess? Even though it's established in the finale that Swarm and Azure delight in the torment of their victims, I don't get it. Whatever, episode 4 wasn't great, but at least it was way better than 1, 3, 5, and 6. That means the next on the docket is episode 5, Survivors of the Flux. And honestly, leading into this episode, I thought it couldn't possibly be worse than episode 3, but leave it to Chris Chibnall to find a way. I have never been so close to turning off an episode of Doctor Who out of sheer boredom as I was while watching Survivors of the Flux. And I honestly came quite close to just turning off my DVR recording for Chapter 6. You could tell I'm going a little bit off script here. This is something I meant to write in the script and I forgot to. Whatever. Who cares? Episode 5 was super boring. So what freaking happens in this episode? Yaz, Dan, and Jericho escape from the pocket dimension off-screen with literally no explanation of how they did it. And Peggy is just freaking gone. Peggy has vanished from the plot. No one will mention for the entirety of this episode and the next that there is a random small child trapped several decades before her own birth. Okay, sure thing. Sudden 3-year time skip, and it's 1904, and the human trio are going on a global Indiana Jones-style adventure to discover the date and time of the final Flux event. I'm sorry, I was under the impression that the Flux was a continuous process, so what actually is the final Flux event? And furthermore, how do these three know that it's going to happen? And what has led them to believe that there are archaeological discoveries to be made from various cultures across the planet that will tell them when it will happen? The answer is, don't think about it, because literally nothing in this plotline has any effect on the overall narrative. And then, at the end of the episode, Joseph Williamson, yeah, remember him, shows up and explains that the tunnels he was digging were actually tunnels through time because the flux is weakening the fabric of space-time or something. And he rescues Yaz, Dan, and Jericho and brings them into the tunnels and says, don't go down that one tunnel because it is very bad and evil. Also in this episode, the Grand Serpent is back. The guy from Vinder's flashback, remember him? Yeah, he can travel through time and is immortal and can also mind control an alien snake now. So he shows up on Earth in the 1960s to influence the course of UNIT's development, all leading to him shutting down UNIT in 2017, all so we can explain a throwaway line in Resolution about how UNIT lost funding, and so we can set up a rivalry between him and Kate Stewart that doesn't actually matter, because the beginning of their rivalry is the last time these two characters will interact face to face for the rest of this serial. But the main meat, I guess, of this episode is the Doctor being brought to Division headquarters in the gap between universes, or the division between universes, right? I'm not the only one who spelled this joke out explicitly, if you know what I mean. There, she meets Tecteun, who is the current leader of Division, and Tecteun does the grand reveal. The Division is basically the space Illuminati on a universal scale. You know, the thing that everybody already thought it was. Anyway, Tecteun is the one who started the Flux, to kill the Doctor specifically, despite the Flux having absolutely no bearing whatsoever on how the Doctor has now been brought before her, totally defenseless and at her mercy. Tecteun explains that Division is going to a new universe now, but she can bring the Earth with her and restore the Doctor's lost memories, and all the Doctor has to do is rejoin Division. But the Doctor gets understandably angry at Tecteun, not only because of the Flux, but for all the ways Tecteun influenced her now forgotten past, for how Tecteun performed cruel experiments on her, literally murdering her time and time again. No, wait, the Doctor doesn't actually bring that up at all. Instead, she goes off on Tecteun for exploiting the Doctor's unique capabilities, taking credit for it, and using it to become one of the most powerful and influential beings who ever... Hold on, wait a sec, that's not why the Doctor is angry either. The Doctor is mad at Tecteun for adopting her even though she wasn't 100% totally sure that the Doctor was actually a lost child. Are you kidding? That's like one of the least horrible things Tecteun has ever done. Whatever, who cares? The important thing is that now things are actually moving forward. The Doctor is finally face to face with the person who ruined her life, erased her memories, and started the Flux. The setup is all there. Tecteun is effectively the main villain of not just season 13, but of the entire Chibnall era of Doctor Who. Finally, we can... Oh, Tecteun is dead now. Swarm and Azure just showed up out of nowhere and killed her. Okay, so that's episode 5 done with. It's finale time, and there's still a gazillion plot threads to wrap up, so let's see how they do that. I'll be honest with you guys, I blanked most of this episode out of my memory almost immediately after watching it, so I may get a couple of details wrong, but I'll give it the old college try. For you. Episode 6, The Vanquishers, is the exact opposite of a multi-doctor special. Instead of 3 different doctors in the same place and time, it's 3 of the same doctor in different places and times. Also, I'm glad to know that the Doctor would participate in Self-Cest if given the chance, because Moffat confirming that about the Master back in Season 10 wasn't enough. So yeah, when the Doctor showed up in Division headquarters, she was given a magic lapel pin to keep her stable outside the universe, and when she takes the pin off, she splits into 3 of herself. 1 stays in Division HQ, 1 shows up on Carvanista's ship, and 1 winds up in the Williamson tunnels. Honestly, I couldn't keep track of the movements of these 3, especially when 2 of them run into each other, so you're just going to have to accept that she's just going to randomly be showing up all over the place. In the last episode, Belle stole a Lupari ship and Carvanista went after her, and the Sontarans showed up again and landed on Earth through the shield breach they left. After Carvanista explains the situation to Belle and they go back, now with the Doctor in tow, they find out that the Sontarans have killed every Lupari except Carvanista, and they capture the trio. Meanwhile, Tunnel's Doctor meets up with the rest of the wad of protagonists, including Kate Stewart now, and bribe a Sontaran to use Claire and Jericho as psychic operatives to discover the coordinates of the final Flux event. I'm not going to explain the scene where they bribe the Sontaran because literally everyone else has, and this video is way too long already, but suffice it to say that it's really dumb. The Doctor and Carvanista get captured, while the Doctor gets interrogated by the Grand Serpent, who is working with the Sontarans now, and really wants Kate Stewart dead, but the Doctor escapes or something. Claire winds up on Carvanista's ship, but Jericho sacrifices himself for absolutely no reason whatsoever, so one of the only protagonists I actually cared about is dead now. Cool. Anyway, Belle finds out that the Sontarans have been offering to use the Lupari fleet to shield any species that forms a peace treaty with them from the Flux, and the Daleks and Cybermen have taken them up on that. Meanwhile, Vinder went inside Passenger because he was really convinced that Belle was in there, but instead he finds Diane. Diane is, in fact, the only one inside Passenger now. Swarm and Azure killed everybody else, but she was spared because she was too insignificant to bother killing, but apparently not too insignificant to bother kidnapping in the first place, because God forbid anyone in this serial has any consistent motivations. But Diane knows how to escape Passenger now, somehow? So Diane and Vinder make it out and bring Passenger to where the combined fleets of the Sontarans, the Lupari, the Daleks, and the Cybermen are massing. It's here where we find out that the Flux is antimatter, and that regular matter can't stop antimatter, but it can only slow it down. Now, setting aside that that's not at all how antimatter actually works, why the heck was antimatter yeeting people through time? I guess it's implied that the Flux's composition got somehow altered by the Doctor shooting time vortex energy into it back in episode 1, but could Chibnall really not think of any better way to get everybody where they needed to be? And if not, then why not just let the Flux be its own thing that's not analogous to anything in the real world? Doctor Who is about as far away from hard sci-fi as you can get, so you're allowed to do that, you know? Whatever, who cares? The Sontarans are planning to betray the Daleks and the Cybermen by using the Lupari ships to save only themselves and sacrificing the Daleks and the Cybermen to slow the Flux down. Hold on again, we established literally in the last episode that the Flux has destroyed nearly every galaxy in the universe already. There are only like 10 to 15 galaxies left at this point. Now, I have a degree in astrophysics, so you can trust me when I say that there are supposed to be way more galaxies than that, and that galaxies, even the really, really small ones, have way more mass in them than a couple of space fleets. So why does anybody expect these two fleets to slow the Flux down any more than the entire rest of the universe did? And that's ignoring the fact that the two fleets would have been destroyed anyway if they hadn't come here, so surely it would have had the same effect on the Sontarans whether the fleets had come here or not. But anyway, the Doctor uses Carvanista's ship to take control of the Lupari fleet. And this is the part where I tone down my overblown anger a little bit, because I want to make it very, very clear that my anger at this specific scene in this specific episode is very, very genuine. I haven't seen much Classic Who, but I have seen Genesis of the Daleks. And that serial contains one of the most iconic scenes in the entire series, in which the Fourth Doctor has the chance to stop the Daleks from ever being created, and his struggle with deciding whether he has that right, and his fear at becoming like the things he hates most is beautifully portrayed. In modern Who, the 12th Doctor had the same chance in the Witch's Familiar, and he didn't do it. When the Ninth Doctor orders what he believes is the last Dalek in the universe to kill itself, and the Dalek tells him that he would make a good Dalek, the terror in his face is heartbreaking. In that season's finale, when the Dalek Emperor asks him if he is a coward or a killer, it is treated as an unambiguous victory when the Doctor chooses coward. Previous showrunner Stephen Moffat has gone on record saying that one of his driving motivations behind what happened in the 50th anniversary special was that he didn't believe that the Doctor could ever bring himself to destroy Gallifrey. Now, the 13th Doctor's sense of morality has always been a bit off. In Arachnids in the UK, she said that letting animals choke to death under their own body weight was more humane than shooting them. In Spyfall Part 2, she weaponized the antagonist's skin color against him after already having defeated him. But in Doctor Who Flux, Chapter 6, The Vanquishers, she takes it to a whole nother level. In this episode, she watches the Flux advance on the Cybermen, the Daleks, and the Sontarans. 3 entire species fleeing for their lives. 3 entire sentient, sapient races desperately clawing at their last hope to escape extinction. And she takes control of the Lupari fleet, the only thing in the universe capable of protecting them. And she assembles the shield wall on the wrong side. She looks at these 3 terrified races and has everything she needs to save them at her fingertips. And she kills them all. And it is treated as an unambiguous victory. In his final scene before regenerating, the 12th Doctor, my personal favorite incarnation of the character, gives a speech advising his next self how to be the Doctor. In this speech, he says, and I quote, "Remember, hate is always foolish and love is always wise. Always try to be nice, but never fail to be kind." In a different speech, just before having his memories of longtime companion Clara Oswald erased, he says to her, "Never be cruel and never be cowardly, and if you ever are, always make amends." In this scene, I firmly believe that the Doctor has violated those rules they gave to themselves. In this scene, the Doctor I have seen as something of a role model since I watched my first episode of the show something like 8 or 9 years ago, tore down almost everything I liked about them as a character. And that, more than anything, is why Doctor Who Flux Chapter 6, The Vanquishers, is my least favorite episode of Doctor Who. I'd like to remind you all at this time that I do not hate Jodie Whittaker, I do not hate Chris Chibnall, and I do not hate anyone who contributed to this episode in any way. And I say this because I could certainly see someone listening to all the stuff I just said and believing that I do hate someone. Quite frankly, I'm having a bit of a hard time right now keeping myself convinced that I don't hate Chris Chibnall. So before I say anything I might regret, let's go ahead and talk about the rest of this episode, okay? So, after mercilessly destroying countless sapient beings, the Doctor drops Passenger in front of the oncoming flux wave and opens his pocket dimension, and the whole flux is drawn in by the apparently infinite pocket dimension inside. I actually don't have much to riff on here. This is not the worst solution imaginable to the flux, as it combines pre-established story elements in a new and unique way that could believably solve the problem. And this is all only slightly undercut by the fact that the Doctor, who, let me remind you, is fresh off 3 concurrent genocides, says, and I quote, "Okay, Passenger, hoover up the flux for us." And then all the protagonists go back into the tunnels with the Grand Serpent, who is still here for some reason, and they send him through the very bad and evil door as if that's some form of karmic retribution, even though the Grand Serpent plotline never once interacted with the tunnels plotline. Oh, also, Yaz, Dan, Kate, and Williamson are still here. They do nothing in this episode, absolutely nothing. Oh, and Belle and Vinder hug each other, so I guess that's supposed to wrap up their entire plotline of hunting for each other across the universe. But let's check in on Division HQ, Doctor, shall we? Swarm and Azure have taken a hold of the device that Tectayun stored the Doctor's lost memories in, and they're finally going to give her a look. This is it. This is the moment we've been building up to for 2 entire seasons now, and arguably even longer. What could these hidden memories possibly be? Well, they wind up in the Doctor's mindscape, where there's a floating house, and Swarm shows up and says, "All your memories are in this house, watch me destroy it." Oh, no, gotcha, I'm putting it back together again, and then they leave the Doctor's mindscape. That's it. I'm not kidding you. That's what we spent the past 17 hours of storyline setting up. So the Ravagers explain that what they just did to the house is effectively what they're going to do to the universe. Let the flux destroy it, and then rewind time to destroy it again, over and over, just for the pure sadism of it. I don't really mind this as a villain motivation. It's not the most original in the world, but sometimes evil for the sake of evil can work. I just don't get how this connects to the whole war between time and space thing they were talking about earlier. Speaking of which, they're bringing the Doctor back to the Temple of Atropos to meet their leader, the physical embodiment of time itself? Why has no one mentioned that the Ravagers have a leader? Why have they always been talking about time like it's a force of nature when it's an actual entity? And why does the physical embodiment of time kill the Ravagers and then reassemble the 3 Doctors back into one and then leave? This is the most literal Deus Ex Machina I have ever seen. A literal god just showed up out of absolutely nowhere, solved the plot, refused to elaborate, and then left. What is writing? Okay. So apparently this character, the manifestation of time, has been showing up occasionally in the expanded media since the 90s, but that still doesn't make it okay. In a show like this, at least 90% of your audience is going to have almost no familiarity with the expanded media, so requiring your audience to have read the tie-in novels to understand the plot of the main TV show is never going to be okay. At the end of the episode, Diane dumps Dan for absolutely no reason. The Doctor formally grants Dan companion status, and then she dumps the memory device way into the depths of the TARDIS so that she can never find it again, unless she really asks for it. We're quite blatantly moving the big reveal further on down the road, but there has to be a point where Chibnall realizes that if next week's reveal is always the actual reveal is coming next week, I promise, people are going to stop believing him eventually. Also, the Doctor already came to the conclusion that she doesn't need to know her past in Division at the end of Season 12, and while backsliding absolutely does happen in real life, having her learn the same exact lesson in 2 character arcs in a row is incredibly narratively unsatisfying. Alright, now that I've finally made it through every episode in this season, let me finish with a few bullet points of the biggest general problems I have with this plot, and why I think Doctor Who Flux doesn't work. 1. The various story arcs were way too disjointed. The only real connective tissue between most of the subplots in this story, and quite frankly, the story feels at points like it was composed exclusively of subplots, is that they shared the same inciting incident and then drifted apart from there. That's typically the opposite of what you want to do with a story with a bunch of disparate arcs. The fact that the Doctor needed to literally be in 3 places at once to wrap up everything is very indicative that a very poor job was done of getting the arcs to link together in the end. 2. Too many of the characters were redundant or insignificant. This applies to both the protagonists and the villains. On the protagonist side, Yaz, Dan, Kate, and Williamson have very little to do for almost the entire season, and there was almost no point to keeping Jericho and Claire around after Village of the Angels. Chibnall had this figured out with Mary Seacole and General Logan back in episode 2, so I'm not sure how he had already forgotten it by episode 4. Really, the only characters you couldn't do without were the Doctor and Carvanista, and maybe Bell and Vinder. On the villain side, it hardly warrants saying that the Grand Serpent didn't need to be there, and you really could have made do with only one Ravager as well. In fact, it probably would have helped everything feel more coherent if they had chosen either Division or the Ravagers to be the main villains, instead of trying to juggle both. 3. Way too much time was spent on the build-up of mysteries with lackluster payoff. This is compounded by the fact that the Chibnall era has always seemed to struggle with this. Was there even a single person who didn't call that the Doctor was the Timeless Child by the time the Master revealed it? Nearly every mystery in this serial either A, was painfully easy to figure out almost the second it was introduced, B, failed to shake up what had already been established in any meaningful way, or C, just didn't get answered at all. And when almost the entire plot is centered around building up these mysteries, that makes most of the plot feel like a waste of time. And most egregious, 4. The characters are hard to connect to. Most of them get surface-level development at best, so all you really have to get attached to are their personalities. There wasn't really anybody that I felt I had anything in common with that I could empathize with them over, so when things happened to the characters, I didn't feel anything. And this gets even worse when, later in the season, the show starts rocketing through everything. We've seen how much losing the Time Lords traumatized the Doctor, so why don't we get to see her help Carvanista through his grief? Why don't we get to see Dan and Vinter commiserate over being separated from the people they love? Yaz isn't taken seriously by her police superiors, and Jericho isn't taken seriously by the scientific community, so why not have them sit down and talk about that? We get a little bit of backstory for Bell and Vinder, but it's completely swallowed up by all the other stuff going on, that by the time we get to their reunion, even the show itself is acting like it's just another thing to mark off the checklist. To paraphrase popular sci-fi and fantasy author Brandon Sanderson, a serviceable plot with amazing characters is going to please a much bigger portion of your audience than an amazing plot with boring characters. Unfortunately, Flux doesn't perform particularly well in either category. I'm quite sure there's several times in this video that I said something along the lines of, we'll come back to that later, and then I never actually came back to it, but I'm not going to figure out where that happens because this script is long, I am lazy, and there seems to me to be a level of ironic appropriateness to that given the material I'm discussing. There are still 3 episodes left starring Jodie Whittaker as the Doctor with Chris Chibnall as showrunner, one on New Year's Day 2022, one on Easter 2022, and one in the fall of 2022 for BBC's centenary anniversary, but I don't intend to watch them, at least not for a while. I'll probably read wiki summaries or something, because I'm too dedicated to this series to stay away entirely, but I think it's best for my mental health if I take a break until there's good Doctor Who on TV again. Doctor Who Flux has thoroughly destroyed what little faith I had left in this show. Did you know that it's canon in the Doctor Who universe, in the era before Time Lords took control of history, woolly mammoths were godlike beings who created and ruled over humanity, and that the Mammoth King was resurrected in the current version of reality and threatened to go to war against Gallifrey? Can we get a TV story about that, please? Now, good night, everyone. I am a broken man, and I need to be alone for a while. The outro is cancelled, now let me be.